best in Australia. The Jewish community is great. I'm always frequently telling people why can't the rest of Australia be more like Queensland in many ways. So thank you for having me. And it's great to have the Honourable Dr. Gary Johns here. I'm very excited to hear his talk, to honour him at the Melanie Phillips inaugural talk, which has been put together by the Minority Impact Coalition. So a big shout out for this important event tonight. It's been 2.5 years since October 7th. It's been over 2 months since the Bondi Massacre. This has been the most difficult period in the history of the Australian Jewish community. We're all feeling very tired. I speak to many Jewish people across the country, and there's a sense of pessimism, to be honest. There are people who are considering whether they have a future in this country, and there are people who are actually taking practical steps to leave Australia in different stages. We can't deny what is going on. And this didn't come out of nowhere. Immediately after October 7, this hateful rhetoric burst into our faces. We saw it at the Sydney Opera House. We saw it on our university campuses. We saw it in our arts festivals. We saw it with our Islamic hate preachers. And we all knew where it was heading. We watched as synagogues were torched. We watched as Jewish people were doxxed. What happened at Bondi was the result of over 2 years of ignored warnings. In a short time, there have been so many incidents that it's all become a bit of a blur. It seems like there's a major anti-Semitic incident every few days. I mean, in Brisbane, the main synagogue just a few days ago had an incident. And quickly this will just become another statistic. Some of the trends are looking very bleak. An ill-thought-out immigration policy is importing ancient hatreds. TikTok has brainwashed a generation. And they're making up a larger and larger share of voters and eventually leaders as well. Some of the responses also haven't been well thought out. The hate speech laws are not the answer. As we've introduced law after law, there is zero evidence that they've made a dent in the anti-Semitism. On the contrary, actually. Now, tonight's talk, we're going to hear soon from Dr. Gary Johns. It's going to be about why the left turned its back on Israel and the Jewish community. But a whole other topic for a different occasion is going to be how some segments of the right are starting to turn on Israel and the Jewish community. And some of this has been because the Jewish community has now become very associated with these laws which are cracking down on freedom of speech and are very unpopular. Also, when Jewish groups boycott a party that is at the moment polling at about 25% of voters, whatever you think of them, that seems like it's shooting the community in the foot to be putting yourself out of the picture there. But it's not all doom and gloom. There's been a lot of positive developments as well. I'll just very briefly tell you about some of the experiences I've had with the Australian Jewish Association. For those who don't know, AJA was founded in 2017 as a national organisation to represent Jewish people who hold centre-right views. From the outset, our focus has been on principled advocacy and not on popularity. A couple of examples. We believe that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people. That includes Judea, Samaria, and a united Jerusalem. There can never be a Palestinian state created there. This is the position of the overwhelming majority of Israelis, and according to recent polling, it's also the position of the majority of Australian Jews. Yet every single other major Jewish organisation supports the creation of a state of Palestine. Now, they'll say the timing isn't right now. They'll say we need to wait until we've got a bit of a better partner. But to be honest, this lack of conviction doesn't convince anybody. In the last few years, I wrote a few articles, and I wasn't the only one, that said that unless there was a change in policy, the federal government was going to recognise the state of Palestine. I mean, if the only argument is that maybe the timing is not great, it's not effective, it's not going to work. And indeed, we saw that strategy did fail, and the Albanese government recognised a non-existent state of Palestine. On the proposed Indigenous voice, AJA saw that this would be a danger to the Jewish community immediately. We were the only Jewish group to oppose it, and in fact, the only ethnic group in all of Australia. When we did come out against it, the polling showed that it was popular. We opposed it before it became unpopular, but we were labelled as far right for doing so. I think the statistics show that unless the majority of Australians are far right, there's a silent majority supporting this. And for those who don't know, Thomas Mayo, who was one of the leading proponents of the voice and who would have received a position in this, has now become a major anti-Israel activist leading some of these rallies. So this is the sort of people that some Jewish groups were working with and that thought were a partner, and I think if we would have had that set up, it would have been quite bad. But on other issues, we've seen some of the Jewish groups move towards our position. Since the inception of AJA, there's only been one political party we've refused to deal with, and that's been the Greens. We always called them anti-Semitic, even while others in the Jewish community were courting them and wanting to meet up with them. I think now that the AJA position has been adopted by all Jewish groups, this also goes for some of the interfaith that was going on with some of the radical Islamic leaders. So the lesson from this is the Jewish community needs to engage in principled advocacy. AJA now has thousands of members. We're the largest Australian Jewish organisation on social media. We have almost 200,000 followers across the platforms. But what can we do as individuals? Well, education is key. Never stop learning. Attending talks like the one you're going to hear tonight. This is important. But it's not just about learning. We need to take what we learn and put it into practice. We're a tiny community, so we need every single person to be an activist in their own field, whatever that means on an individual level. The other work we need to do, which the Minority Impact Coalition is doing so well, is build coalitions. Instead of spending all our time fighting hostile groups, we should work closely with like-minded, decent communities. The Persian community, the Hindu community, the Druze community, where we have a very special representative of here tonight, and there's many more. These are groups who share our values and who we should be allying with. So speaking of allies, Dr. Gary Johns, we have a real friend here, and it's an honour to hear from you, to be involved. We're going to hear a proper introduction from Warren, who's here. But yeah, look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
When I first mentioned that Gary Johns is going to come and speak to us, they said, "Is he the father of Andrew Matty Johns?" I said, "No, wrong Gary Johns." Gary is an Australian writer, and he has been a politician. He was a member of the House of Representatives from 1987 to 1996, holding the Queensland seat of Petrie. That used to be my seat. And he served as a minister in the Keating government. Gary had 2 children and 2 grandchildren, both girls and girls. Gary has also been, or is a columnist with the Australian newspaper, and author of numerous papers and books. He writes regularly for The Spectator. Who reads The Spectator here? Yeah, okay. And Quadrant. His latest book is The Burden of Culture. In 2017, Gary was appointed as the Commissioner of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. He resigned in 2022 following the Albanese's election to office. In 2023, Gary was chairman of Recognise a Better Way, a group that argued no for the voice to Parliament, and he formed the research organisation Close the Gap Research, of which he is chairman. We are honoured to have Gary come and speak with us tonight about a very important topic that affects Jewish Australians specifically and all Australians generally. Please welcome Gary as he comes to give us his thoughts on why the ALP and the left have turned their backs on Israel and the Jews. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren, and Robert, and Roz. Warren approached me a couple of months ago with a very specific topic, and I'm grateful to him because he set me a task, and I had to think about this quite a lot. And well, I've been asked to explain why the left turned its back on Israel and the consequences for Jewish people in Australia. I can do that, but I want to go further than that. I want to suggest what Australian Jews should do about it. And I suggest 7 tasks, and these are my reasons. The cardinal sin of Israel is its success. The left cannot abide success. In the fettered minds of leftists, success implies wrongdoing and oppression. Only losers count in the left's pantheon. Now, the essence of modern leftist thinking is to support the wreckers and oppose the creators. This is their way of achieving the mythical and mystical goal of equality. Early Israel garnered sympathy among left intellectuals, especially because of the dread of the Holocaust. It's well to remember, however, that the perpetrators were fascists, enemies of the left. As those events faded from collective memory and were replaced by an economically, democratically and militarily successful nation, Israel fell out of favour. At least since the victory in the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel has been portrayed as a colonial oppressor. The first task is that Australian Jews should choose their friends carefully. The second strong element in leftist thinking is the fall from grace of the nation state in favour of internationalism. The nation state is seen as a source of evil, particularly in Europe, which has collapsed into a super union run by unelected bureaucrats. The United Nations has also become a forum for internationalism and its peculiar form of moralism, especially through its constant attacks on Israel. As Yoram Hazony observed, quote, "We are watching the growth of a generation of young people that for the first time in 400 years does not recognise the national state as the foundation of our freedoms." End of quote. Into this intellectual climate is poured the Palestinians' demand, seemingly against the international trend, but in fact favoured by the UN and much of Europe, that Jews leave or at least cede control of much of the land within the State of Israel. This demand is the basis of the violence against Jews in Australia. The proof is the 300% rise in violent threats, assaults, vandalism and intimidation since the 7th of October 2023 and the murder of 15 innocents at Bondi on the 14th of December 2025. Anti-Semitism was evident in Australia before the 7th of October 2023, but overtly violent intent towards Jews in Australia emerged after the Hamas invasion of Israel. The chants heard at Australian rallies following the Hamas massacre from the river to the sea are unmistakably anti-Zionist, yet they threaten all Jews. F the Jews obviously threatens Jews, but these chants were made in the wake of the Hamas invasion of Israel. As Jonathan Hall, KC, who reviewed the UK government's terrorism legislation, said, quote, "The demonisation of Israelis matters because it's a vehicle for hatred of Jews. If you don't deal with anti-Israeli hatred, you leave wiggle room for those who indulge in anti-Semitism but formally disavow it." End of quote. The second task for Australian Jews is to defend Israel as a nation state and to celebrate its success. Polling by the Arab Centre for Research and Policy Studies in Qatar found that in 2025, 87% of citizens across 15 Arab countries opposed recognising Israel. Those who opposed recognition cited Israel's colonial, racist and expansionist nature and its continued occupation of Palestinian territory. The research found that cultural or religious explanations were largely absent. Now, this Qatar-sanctioned organisation is credible, but it's very pro-Arab. It may be that the colonial reference draws on radical theory and is unlikely to be the language of the Arab public, and that cultural or religious reasons for Arab attitudes towards Israel were unduly masked in the survey. Whatever the rationale, the harsh politics of the belief that Israel is an imposter in the region are unlikely to go away. This is the reality for Israel and for all Jews in an era where the Palestinian cause has become a worldwide phenomenon, globalising intifada. The Prime Minister's response to the massacres of 2023 and 2025 was shaped by his constituencies. His Muslim constituency, his anti-Western constituency, I call them the old radicals, of which he is one, and his postmodern constituency, the young radicals. A melange of all three turn up regularly at the pro-Palestinian anti-Israeli protests. These people are not necessarily anti-Semites, but the logic of each critique is to undermine Israel's legitimacy, indirectly undermining the Jewish people and their achievements. For the past 2 years, activists have occupied university campuses and major city thoroughfares in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and elsewhere. Their attitudes, expressed through their protests and online activity, are more polarised than those of Australians as a whole, but they fuel anger among those predisposed to their evil message. Which raises the question of how many Australians applauded Hamas's invasion and the aspiration of the river to the sea. The third task is that Australian Jews, unlike the Prime Minister, cannot bypass the anti-Zionist basis of violent anti-Semitism. The numbers and values of fellow travellers matter in encouraging a small number of violent or potentially violent people in a community. In a liberal society where there are limits to what governments can and should do to direct their citizens, the habits of voting, accepting the result, and perhaps voting beyond the bounds of tribe, whether religious, ethnic, linguistic or racial, take time to cultivate. It's best to get people used to the responsibilities of liberalism. Herein lies the crucial link to creating a safer, dare we say, more cohesive society by not spanning the impossible schisms of the past. The best arena in which to be illiberal is in selecting migrants. Australia is under no obligation to admit anyone it chooses not to admit. Fortunately, there's a growing consensus around stricter rules for immigrants. Both envoys for anti-Semitism and Islamophobia recommended reviewing immigration and citizenship policies. The Australian public wants stricter scrutiny of applicants for permanent residence, including scrutiny of their values. Given this emerging consensus, a long-term goal of public policy to combat anti-Semitism is to set expectations for future settlers in Australia. Expectations that have been eroded by multicultural lobbies, by migration viewed too readily as an economic tool, and by internationalist human rights untethered from the nation's needs. Australia should send strong signals about integration. One-on-one interviews should be compulsory for all permanent residence applications. The Netherlands requires applicants for permanent residence to have made substantial preparations to ensure sufficient integration before applying. The requirements are set out in the Civic Integration Act of 2021. What values would be unacceptable? Arab-centred polling found that in response to the question, quote, would you accept a political party with whom you disagree taking power through free and fair elections, end quote, up to 50% answered no or declined to answer. Now this result suggests a very high risk profile among immigrants from the region. Migrants applying to come to Australia may not be as illiberal as their fellow countrymen, but can Australia be sure? If you believe there is a place for Jews in Australia, why would you allow 3,000 unvetted Gazans to settle in Australia? Minister Berg chose Gazans to demonstrate solidarity with their cause. It does not matter whether every Gazan holds the view that Israel should be destroyed, or whether, in an interview they deny it. Many live it and have for generations. What about Muslims in Australia? The hero of Bondi was a Muslim. The murderers of Jews in Bondi were Muslim, albeit Islamic extremists. Evidence from a national survey of Islam in Australia in 2019 found that 65% self-described as liberal, 10% self-described as political Islamists, and 3% self-described as militant. What values are at risk among the illiberal minority? While 10% agree that countries that implement classical Sharia laws are more just and fair than Australia, 53% of militants and 32% of political Islamists did so. 53% of militants and 37% of political Islamists disagree that women should have the same rights and opportunities as men. 73% of militants and 65% of political Islamists agreed that establishing a caliphate is a religious obligation. 10% of militants and political Islamists said that Islam generally permitted attacking civilians or non-combatants. Does Berg's behaviour suggest he is less confident in the liberal nature of Islam in Australia than the polling suggests? Regardless, he's also reflecting partisan politics. The Scanlon Mapping Social Cohesion 2024 survey indicates that 51% of Australians on the right have a negative attitude towards Muslims, whereas only 25% on the left do so. Negative attitudes towards Jewish people are strongest among the left at 16% and weakest among the right at 10%. The Islamophobia envoy and the antisemitism envoy recommend greater scrutiny of immigrants. The Australian public agrees. Jews in Australia should feel confident in this view of stringent scrutiny. Few Jews will be excluded when scrutiny focuses on eschewing hatred and embracing democratic values. While 80% of Australians want lower immigration, 66% oppose diversity and support national unity and a shared Australian identity. Some Jewish Australians may not lean towards the anti-diversity national identity camp, but they should understand that their cause is a subset of this strong feeling among Australians that enough is enough. Too many people with incompatible values have changed Australia. The nation has shifted from integration to disintegration, a nation of tribes. The fourth task is that Australian Jews, like the vast majority of other Australians, must argue for unity through a much more selective immigration policy. Labor Foreign Minister Herbert Beer-Evans said in 1947, quote, "We really have to choose between recommending a scheme of partition on the one hand and a complete Arabian unitary state on the other. The latter state puts 600,000 Jews at the mercy of the Arabs." End of quote. Evan understood the deadly situation in which partition was to take place. The Arab states confirmed his suspicions within days of the declaration. Despite being at war with most of their neighbours since 1948, Jews have been successful in creating a thriving nation. By contrast, the Palestinians have failed to establish a successful state, despite being offered statehood 5 times. The denial of specific plots of land has not contributed to their failure. Palestinian leaders have for generations taught their children to hate Jews and to rely on UN handouts. When elections were held, they elected evil, corrupt, governing entities no better than gangs, with the PLO as the early model and Hamas as the later model. Imagine a Palestine as intent as Israel to build a better society. Instead, wherever they occupy land in the Middle East, Palestinians seem to want a one-state solution, not Israel. While Labor Prime Minister Bob Hawke was a strong supporter of Israel, with each victory over Arab states, the left became increasingly ill at ease with a successful Israel. The shift against Israel's success occurs because the intellectual climate in which Labor MPs operate changed. Identity politics, disdain for the nation state, multiculturalism, and an obsession with rights unrelated to merit or responsibilities each played their part. The shift was greatly helped by the fact that there are more left-wing Labor MPs, reflecting the ALP's capture by university graduates. In 1990, the Hawke cabinet consisted of 12 right and 6 left. The Albanese cabinet consists of 12 left and 11 right. Working class solidarity is long forgotten, replaced by solidarity with particularist causes of no particular logic: Indigenous, LGBTI, QI, Palestinians, all imbued with hatred of Western civilization, which created the conditions in which each of the oppressed groups gained its place in the sun. Both the ideological shift in the ALP and the shift in the number of members with such a bent were aided by constituency numbers shifting in favour of Muslims within ALP-held seats. 13 ALP seats have significant Muslim populations. Tony Burke, the Minister for Home Affairs, holds Watson in New South Wales, which is 25% Muslim. This drift has been a long time coming. Bob Hawke recalled Paul Keating telling him, quote, "All right for you and your Jewish mates in Israel, but I've got a whole lot of Muslims in my electorate and it doesn't help me." "Well," Paul Hawke replied, "I'm sorry about that, but that's the way it is, mate." End of quote. The forces arrayed against Jews, insofar as they stem from the Australian Labor Party, are additional to the historic distrust between Islam and Judaism, made acute by Israel's fight for survival, particularly the Hamas invasion of Israel on the 7th of October 2023. Labor has given up on Israel. The deep left is now so strong within the party that former supporters of Israel on the Labor right, still seeking the comfort of the party, have shifted. In a private discussion with Gerard Henderson, not long after the September 11, 2001 Islamist attack on the US, Henderson recounts that Bob Carr, then Labor Premier of New South Wales, said he had concluded that the creation of the State of Israel was a mistake. Bob Carr has not denied this. Carr said the Arab world would never accept the creation of a Jewish state and that Islamist groups would continue to target Western nations. Polling in Arab states suggests Carr is right about the Arab public. He is, of course, wrong that Arab leaders in some states, particularly those that normalised relations with Israel under the Abraham Accords. More recently, the destruction of Hamas in the Gaza Strip and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, along with Iran's degraded nuclear capacity, would suggest Carr has been too pessimistic. Perhaps the most comprehensive statement on Palestinian recognition by a senior Labor figure on the right is that of Gareth Evans, the long-serving and distinguished Labor Foreign Minister. In 2023, in a lecture to the Parliamentary Friends of Palestine, he said, quote, "What unites me and Hawke and Carr and other Labor figures, going back to Evatt, is that Israel should fully respect the rights of Palestinians to live alongside it in peace and dignity in a state of their own," end of quote. Evans argues that morally, the Palestinians deserve a homeland, as do the Jews. But he fails to ask, what if the Palestinians don't want to live alongside Israel in peace? Evidence from more than 80 years suggests they don't. The moral case for recognising Palestine is conditional on their laying down their arms and renouncing their murderous intent. Evans goes on to reflect that, quote, "In the pursuit of national self-determination, some of those most passionate in their causes have sometimes done things that have been misguided and counterproductive and sometimes indefensibly terrible," end of quote. He mentions the short-lived acts of terrorism by Jewish forces against the British in 1947, omitting that they were anti-colonial acts. He also admits that some of the most brutal acts by Israelis were committed by Ben-Gurion's forces against Jewish breakaway groups in 1948. Evans does not reflect on decades of appalling Palestinian terrorism. His lecture was delivered on the 13th of June 2023. One wonders whether he changed his mind about the moral case following the 7th of October 2023 massacre of Jews. On the legal question of statehood, Evans argued that it's sufficient that many other nation-states recognise a Palestinian state, now including Australia, even without recognised borders. There is, of course, no law in this, just the collective thoughts of those who congregate at the UN, which regularly passes resolutions against Israel and has done so for 78 years. Evans addresses political arguments against recognition, including the claim that recognition would undermine the peace process. Quote, "No one doubts that the quality of Palestinian Authority leadership has been less than ideal, nor that Hamas's formal, if not practical, position on Israel's right to exist has been manifestly unhelpful," end of quote. Never the diplomat, I tell you. However, in his opinion, the threat and reality of violence, whether by Hamas or anyone else, diminish rapidly when Palestinians, quote, "see a path to genuine hope for a just and dignified settlement, and it escalates equally rapidly when they don't," end of quote. This is precisely the opposite of what's happened. Israel was edging towards an accord with Saudi Arabia when Hamas invaded. It was a deliberate tactic to stall the settlement. It quite deliberately had every leftist in the Western world including Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong, urging Israel to exercise restraint, that is, not to defend itself. Evans also considered domestic politics and, like Carr before him, railed against the, quote, formidable lobbying power of the Israeli support organisations, end of quote. Evans says, quote, maybe recognising Palestine's statehood would put at risk some of our strongest traditional sources of party fundraising. But sometimes those considerations just have to take second place to decency. End of quote. How embarrassing that Evans forgot to mention the large Muslim constituencies in the ALP. Why does he think Minister Burke rushed 3,000 Palestinians into Australia after October 2023, unless to keep faith with this constituency? Australian Jews must understand that when the shouting stops and the nation building begins, the left has little to offer. As Hall remarked, quote, for human rights defenders, the possibility that destroying Israel will result in the deaths of individual citizens is neither acknowledged nor regretted. End of quote. The fifth task is that Australian Jews must argue for Israel's right to secure borders, and that Palestinian rights must be suspended until they renounce their desire to destroy Israel as a Jewish homeland. What policies are likely to arise out of the Royal Commission into anti-Semitism? Policies to ensure the safety of Jewish Australians must extend beyond mere hate speech legislation recently passed by the Commonwealth Parliament, the Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism, Criminal and Migration Laws Act of 2026. The Combating Anti-Semitism Act amends the Criminal Code, the Crimes Act, in various ways to address aggravated offences committed by preachers and leaders, including grooming recruits, and to prohibit hate groups and hate symbols. A hate crime can involve urging or threatening violence, or publicly inciting hatred of a group of persons because of their race, nationality, or ethnic origin. Religion was omitted from the definition of the target group. There are serious concerns about the scope of these powers and their potential to enable ministers to take summary action to curtail free speech. The Prime Minister's constituents were not entirely happy with him. The Australian Federation of Islamic Councils and the Australian National Imams Council opposed the anti-Semitism bill, arguing that it would, quote, create a greater anxiety within the Australian Muslim community, amounting to Islamophobia, end of quote. Islam is using the language of equality and human rights to keep illiberalism alive in Australia. And the left are desperate to maintain the appearance of inclusion because they do not want to upset the Muslim constituency. Hate speech that is not explicitly related to violence against any person or group is not a sensible device to combat anti-Semitism. There are also amendments to the Migration Act that enhance the Minister's powers to exclude non-citizens for spreading hate and extremism, and expand the Minister's powers to grant visas. There is already hate speech legislation in Australia, particularly in New South Wales and the Commonwealth. Why was this legislation not invoked in the wake of the vicious outpouring against Israel and Jews after the 7th of October 2023? Premier Minns should at least have attempted to prosecute those protesting at the Opera House in the immediate aftermath of the 7th of October massacre in Israel, shouting, "Where's the Jews?" or elsewhere, "I'm elated," under existing laws. It beggars belief that celebrations of murderous violence are not threats of violence. A court defeat would not have been embarrassing. It would have shown politicians that the law was not strong enough to stop speech that promoted violence. For political reasons, Premier Minns and Prime Minister Albanese thought it best to reinforce social cohesion rather than to disturb hateful groups that may be part of a Labor constituency, such as Islamists. The sixth task is that a robust debate, not fettered by hate laws unrelated to violence, or false appeals to social cohesion and human rights, must take place about the role of Islam in a modern democratic Australia. There's one further element to consider: multiculturalism. When the Australian Productivity Commission considered Australia's migrant intake, it concluded that, quote, the social impacts of immigration are likely to be positive as long as immigrants continue to be willing to integrate and the concept of a multicultural community is still embraced by the Australian community, end of quote. In other words, the social impacts of immigration are likely to be positive until they're not. Into this climate of sensitivity steps a Royal Commission, led by the Honourable Virginia Bell, AC. The Bell Royal Commission is to understand antisemitism in Australia in the light of the murders of the 14th of December 2025 at Bondi, and to address antisemitism within the Australian community, including the 7th of October 2023. The Bondi attack was inspired by ISIS. The October 7 attack was carried out by Hamas. Neither was named in the letters patent to the Commissioner. Instead, the letters patent assert that social cohesion will provide the, quote, strongest defence against anti-Semitism and other forms of religious and ideologically motivated extremism, end of quote. This is a tautology. If we had social cohesion, there would be no anti-Semitism. The Commission will no doubt hear from Islamic groups about Islamophobia. It will hear from the Australian Human Rights Commission about racism. It will find that the Commonwealth has already passed laws to restrict the sale of weapons and to restrict speech promoting violence, but not to touch the calls to violence against Jews in passages of the Quran or the Hadith. Here are three very strong clues about the submissions that the Commissioner will receive. Recommendations from the Australian Human Rights Commission's anti-racism report and from the Special Envoys Gillian Siegel and Aftab Malik. The Human Rights Commission will no doubt be prominent in its submissions, but judging by its 2024 report on anti-racism, its stance will be tantamount to giving licence to the overwrought fear of Islamophobia. For example, the Human Rights Commission, quote, wants more effective action by all Australian governments to address far-right extremism and white supremacy, end of quote. That was in 2024, which is an insight into the minds of the Commission and its more than 200 staff. There was no mention of Islamic extremism. More sinister, the Human Rights Commission called on the Australian Government to ensure that migration and citizenship laws comply with international human rights law, with particular attention to inequities experienced by negatively racialised people seeking asylum and refugees and migrants. This is tantamount to outsourcing Australian security to the UN. The Human Rights Commission and human rights advocates so prominent in anti-Israel protests. The worry is that Commissioner Bell will fall into this madness of human rights law as if it would secure cohesion despite its failure to address the reasons some people are at loggerheads. Some hate and want to tear down, others want to create and will fight to hold on to their creation. The Siegel report, studiously ignored by the Albanese government, commenced with considerable strength, quoting actual events, including firebombing. Malik's report, by contrast, quoted survey attitudes and academic opinion on the slights to the Muslim ego. Where did Siegel end up though? She advised strengthening legislation to address anti-Semitic and other hateful or intimidating conduct. The Commonwealth Act seeks to do this, but as we have seen in the Commonwealth of New South Wales, it is political will to prosecute that counts. Prosecutions may help, but they also harden attitudes. Ultimately, the debate has to be won, not by shutting down opponents, but by engaging openly. Siegel recommended embedding Holocaust and anti-Semitism education in school curricula. This is reasonable, but beware. Every group will want a piece of that action. Many have suffered from state-sanctioned massacres. We don't want a contest for the greatest grievance. The history of the world is marked by brilliant civilizations overrun by militarily stronger groups. The Minoans of Crete, Europe's first high culture from 3000 to 1100 BCE, are my favourite example. Success is not guaranteed against a determined belligerent force. Siegel recommends that the government enhance education on Jewish history, identity, culture and anti-Semitism in high school curricula. Malik wants much the same on his side of the equation. Siegel seeks government support for Jewish cultural festivals, education programs and the re-establishment of a Jewish Arts and Cultural Council. Malik wants much the same on his side of the equation. Every lobby wants government funding to tell its story. Australia should bury multiculturalism, not have it government funded. Malik recommended establishing a commission of inquiry, quote, to investigate the main drivers, causes, impacts and lived experiences of anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia, end of quote. He presented polling evidence of negative attitudes among Australians towards Muslims. For example, quote, I believe there is nothing more difficult than being a hijab-wearing Muslim woman. She automatically becomes a target for hate and prejudice, end of quote. It did not enter his mind that the hijab, although I think few would worry about a hijab as opposed to a burqa, worn in a modern Western society that emancipated women generations ago, may prompt legitimate observations about those embedded in a culture that has yet to come to terms with that emancipation. Oppression for Muslims in Australia is hurt feelings. For Jews, it is death. Moral equivalence may be acceptable among postmodern intellectuals, but it is used by evil political forces against Australian citizens. It's hoped that Commissioner Bell does not allow her commission to be used for the special pleadings of Islamophilia. Malik endorsed the Human Rights Commission's National Anti-Racism Framework for protection against religious discrimination. This is code for a blasphemy law. It does not understand that while religion is free from the law, it is not the law. It should fall foul of the law if it incites, promotes, or celebrates violence. He admitted the fact that there are problems in Islamic teachings about Jews. Islam needs reform, as Judaism and Christianity did during the Reformation and the Enlightenment. Islam needs to be relegated to the private realm. One potentially good recommendation from Malik was to highlight how Islamic practices compare with those of the West. It should illustrate that Islam has not reformed in the same way as Christianity, nor was it a key driver of the Enlightenment. The Judeo-Christian heritage and several hundred years of liberalism, as they have worked their way through the common law and the parliaments, have reached a reasonable settlement. It is doubtful that Islam can improve on it. The seventh task is that Australian Jews must argue for a muted multiculturalism, one in which no ethnic, religious or cultural group receives government funding. The Royal Commission is likely to be Labor friendly. It will stick closely to the social cohesion script which suits Islamist interests. Australian Jews must celebrate success. That is your strength. That is your path to safety. You have many friends. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary. And Robert, thank you so much. I'm going to start with the questions on the issue of migrants and immigrants. Robert, it's a question of values. It was mentioned that there is a refusal to assimilate. There should be greater scrutiny of those who come into the country, yet there are people who are still granted citizenship. Should Australia consider revoking citizenship of those who won't assimilate?
It's a good question. It's a good question. I mean, for starters, I think we need to have major slowdown of immigrants that are coming in. There's a lot of good people, there's also a lot of bad people, and when you have such a volume of people, it's not possible to properly scrutinise people. So a major slowdown, a pause if that's necessary. But your question about people already here, what can you do? Well, I think if they are dual citizens, it's quite easy. Then their Australian citizenship should potentially be revoked if they have somewhere else to go. I think if they don't, if they only have Australian citizenship, even though other countries do revoke their citizenship for things which are not in line with the values of the country, but I think it might be a little bit difficult. So we might have to look at what other solutions, what other ideas we can work on. One of the issues is going to be education. When we have some of these people are learning in some pretty radical places, even in Australia. So we need to look at what education are they getting, what are they getting outside of the school. This proliferation of these prayer halls. The Wisdom Hadad one is quite famous, but there's a lot of them. They're small, they're operating in other buildings. So what are these kids doing out of school? What can we do to try and stop some of this extremism? And I think, if we address it now, we might have a bit of a chance of doing something about it.
We would like to ask a question.
We're hearing from Angus Taylor now about maybe monitoring people coming into the country according to Australian values, and it seems to be an incredibly generic term, and it seems to be almost impossible to impose any kind of regulations or whatever on what are Australian values. So my question is, how can that kind of airy-fairy kind of policy be actually implemented realistically?
Are you addressing it?
To Dr. Johns.
It is possible. The Dutch passed a law in 2021 which was explicitly integrationist, and in order to become a permanent resident, you have to have the equivalent of a certificate for in being a Dutchman. Read, write, speak, and understand the Netherlands before you get the right to come in. So we could do that in Australia. We have the benefit of sending a very strong signal to those in Australia that there are new rules afoot and that you have to integrate. You can be as illiberal as you want and tough as you want because it's offshore. But you're also sending a signal that you have to be ready to live by our rules, which was the assumption up until the 1960s. So look, the Dutch are doing it. I haven't found others, but it is possible to have to put people through the hoops before they come in, and if you want to fail them, you fail them. Their rights within Australia, of course, will be much less and more expensive if they're offshore.
Saying something about that?
Okay. So I've got just a quick question before my other question.
Good question.
I always take advantage. I think I've got a bit of a reputation.
She's wearing an amazing T-shirt that some amazing designer made.
Yeah,
Anyone can buy.
Just ask.
If they wanted to.
Just ask our beautiful friend here if you'd like one, and she'll give you a link to the website.
In Queensland, we have Readers and Writers Against the Genocide. So we've got Readers and Writers for Critical Thinking.
Which doesn't happen much. And on the back it's got no other land, because it's actually Jews that have no other land, not Palestinians. They've got plenty of land. So my first question is about what you just said, Dr. Johnson. That is, if that is a possibility, why isn't it being done, and what can be done to implement that? I mean, a lot of people have really good ideas, but if nobody does anything about them, they just stay as ideas. So that's my first question. But please, if I'll say my second one.
I'll answer that one first.
All right, yeah, right. Then you might forget.
Lobby. You have to talk to politicians and say, did you know that the Netherlands passed an act, blah, 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 and just tell them, because I don't have a lot of success in lobbying, I can tell you, but it helps. You just have to go and talk to people and say they are doing it in the Netherlands. And I think if we looked it up, the Swedes will be doing it. Most of Northern Europe will be doing it. They have a problem of very large Islamic groups sitting in their countries, and they have to do something about it. So the Dutch, being very practical people, they passed a law to say, you have to learn to be a Dutchman before you can live in this country.
I find it ironic that you should need to start that question with, did you know? As in, our politicians know nothing, right? So, oh yeah, did you know that the Netherlands did that? Oh really? No, I'm just a politician in Australia. I was at an event on the weekend in Sydney, the Advance Conference, and one of the speakers was, I think she was the last speaker, Moira Deeming, and she is a teacher, a mother, and a politician, an MP. And she's, I didn't even know that. And I said to her, when I got a chance there too to ask a couple of questions, and I asked her whether she's doing anything about Teachers for Palestine, who are introducing a new curriculum in Australian schools this year, effective this year, for K-12 on Palestine. So education in our state schools about Palestine. So where's the equivalent education on any other country in the world? Because there aren't any other countries in the world actually, there's only Palestine. So she had not heard about it, and she's an MP, a parent, and a teacher, and hadn't. But she very, it was great because she wrote it down.
In her defence, she's a very good person, a good MP, and has been under enormous pressure from her own party. The whole story. Disgraceful. Yeah. She now knows about it. You told her. So that's what you have to do. You have to. MPs have so much coming across their desk and all sorts of things to worry about. You go and tell them, and then and probably tell them a second time. I've lobbied a particular minister in the Christopher government 5 times now. I'm not sure she's listening, but I'll keep telling her because I know it's not her fault almost. It's sort of like I've got so much going on in my head, I just don't have space for you. So you've got to push in. You've got to tell your success story. Get off the grievance bit and talk about the successes. So I think that will ring a bell. And to reinforce that we want successful people. Why would we want to carry the burden of the world? That's been the mindset of immigration and the left for decades now. We should take the huddled masses. Yeah, okay, it worked well when we wanted factory fodder, quote unquote, that was the assumption behind it, and then everyone would play by the rules. Those assumptions don't work anymore. So I think we're entitled now to say, we'll pick and choose, we have to work at this very carefully, and there'll be explicit rules. Just one little bit on the rules about throwing people out. Have to be very careful because it could end up tit for tat. The left might throw out people they don't like, and the right might throw out people they don't like, and so on and so forth. So I think that's to use very carefully, very wisely.
I have another question here, Gary.
Gary, this is a question for you. I was interested in your sort of history of the left's anti-Semitism in Australia. I wondered about your thoughts on whether it's possible to address anti-Semitism in the left without addressing anti-Americanism. Given that a lot of this developed during the Vietnam period with the It's Time generation, who are sort of working their way out now, to what extent is it necessary to deal with that, or maybe anti-capitalism, as the underlying cause of anti-Semitism?
I don't think it's underlying cause. The theme, talking before, is the left love a loser. So, and they don't like the big fella. So, as we grew up, we're all anti-American, weren't we? And then you grow up and say, no, actually Americans are pretty good, and they also keep us as safe as we can be. And then the Jews did the wrong thing and became successful, so they fell out. The one chink, it's a very interesting one, was Labor and Liberal voted and supported equality in marriage for gays, right? And the Muslim communities in those Western Sydney electorates didn't like that at all. But then again, gays were at the top of the list of oppressed people, you see. They'd made it to the top. So if you make it to the top, you get all the garlands. It doesn't matter whether you're right, wrong, or indifferent. So you have to turn around. Don't try and be the top of the grievance. Be the best at what you are. And I think Jewish people have proved that 1,000 times over. But everyone has forgotten about what it took to build this society. So we have to remind them, whether it's at school but don't play the sort of worries of anti-this and anti-that.
Okay, cheers.
I'm just gonna, I have to just jump in on this one. I'll just give you guys a little anecdote. So I'm Israeli, I lived my whole life in Israel. My parents are from America, so I have those American cultural aspects to me, and my accent is American. They were New Yorkers. And I'm married to a woman, so I'm of that cohort as well. And when we first moved to Australia, we moved to Rockhampton, where we lived for about 8 months. And I was applying for jobs, and it was quite difficult. I went to a job interview, and they said, "Okay, well, where are you from?" And I said, "Well, I don't know if to say if I'm Israeli or American, because I don't know honestly which one you'll think is worse." And it made them laugh, and then the conversation continued, and they asked about my family life, and I said, "Well, my partner's a woman," and so now you probably really don't know what to make of me, because Rockhampton's quite traditional. And they actually ended up hiring me, and I had a really, really good time working there. But that was always the case. Every interaction I have in Australia, and from October 7, it took a very, very sharp turn to the worst, and the gay card doesn't work for me, Gary, I can tell you. It doesn't beat the Israeli and the American cards. I'm not in the box of the virtuous at the moment, no matter how I frame myself. So just to give, just a little anecdote on that. But I will say that the minority voices are very, very powerful. I think that one thing, we're speaking a lot about Islamism and a lot about deporting or who, to allow in for immigration. In the United States, there are reformist Islam movements. There are people who have come together and have organized and have said, Islam is our spiritual culture. We love it, we honor it, but it needs reform, it needs to change. And in Australia, we actually don't have any of those movements. So one of the things I'm focusing on now, and I think probably Robert's also focusing on this a little bit in a different way, is to discover those hidden streams here in Australia, because they are here, they're just very secretive, and to empower them and bring them out, because change can only come from within communities at the end of the day. No matter how many we deport, how many we let in or don't let in, we're in a situation where there's so many people here that will never commit an outright crime, and we need to work within communities.
Thank you, Rose. 3 questions, one here, one there, and one there, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
I'd just like to find out what you think about Queensland's new hate speech laws.
So I'm not 100% across them. I got an invitation from the Queensland Parliament to address them on these laws, and I accepted. We sent back, we're happy to speak, and then they didn't answer, and as it was getting closer to the date, we sent a few more emails, and they just never replied, so I'm not sure what happened there. I don't know who spoke to them, and didn't want us to speak. But look, they're not as bad as some of the other laws that have been passed in other states and federally, and they are actually much more targeted. I think the Queensland government is doing a much better job than some of the other governments, but I think there's still a bit of room. I mean, the laws don't specifically ban individual phrases; they allow phrases to be banned, and so a future government, a different government, can ban different phrases. So it does set a dangerous precedent. And the other question is on the effectiveness. Are they going to work? These people just change their phrases. It's not that hard to come up with a new phrase. So they won't say that exact one. They'll say one a little bit different. It's a bit of a cat and mouse game. It's not addressing the actual issue there. And I think it's a dangerous precedent. And no doubt a future government will ban phrases associated with conservative groups and that they'll consider racist.
I agree.
Well, good evening, Gary. Questions for you. Your introduction and your speeches tonight indicated that Jews need to do 7 things, and here's the list of things that you need to do. I must admit, being Jewish, I struggled with that concept. I'm trying to put this as diplomatically as possible. But I think that you have it wrong. I think the royal we need to do something about it, not Jews, with the exception of many Christians in this room who I know personally and have done wonderful things and are great supporters. The mainstream Christian churches who dominate Australia in regards to population, they are the ones who should be working harder to actually support such a small group as the Jewish group in Australia. And even though we disproportionately contribute more on a whole range of fields, this isn't about us as being the 7 things the Jews have to do. This is a thing, in my view, that it's not about us, it's about the you that aren't here. And I wonder what your opinion is about that.
I agree with you. But if I don't set out a positive agenda speaking to a mainly Jewish group, it's an agenda that you have to take to a wider field, and that I hope you'll guide Christians in a broader community in what I'm hoping is a fairly firm and a fairly positive set of tasks. And I agree, it's not yours alone. You couldn't possibly solve it alone. But I think you can help us. I think you can guide us. I think you can let us know where you're headed. And it won't be, please, government, can you give us some money to tell our story? That would be a fatal error. So you should be watching this Royal Commission very carefully. The Prime Minister and his ministers will be sitting on this, trying to steer Commissioner Bell in a particular direction and make it seem as though all is well when you know it won't be. It'll be a papering over exercise. And we are talking anti-Semitism. So I think Jewish people ought to have an agenda, and maybe push working them up, which can be helpful to the rest of us. You'll convince us, and then we will join with you, and it will be a big we and a broader agenda. So I'm with you. I agree with you.
I can say that Paul, who asked the question, is one of the rare people who has devoted most of his life in Brisbane to volunteering his time in the various Jewish organizations, and he's currently president of the State Zionist Council of Queensland. So he's humble, so he doesn't say that.
And this is our last question from Chris.
It is Chris. Yes, thanks very much. Many thanks for your time and presentation tonight. Found it most informative. One of the things that's puzzled me about this whole affair since 2023, and I don't recall who observed it, I noticed it, maybe Douglas Murray, is that when Hamas attacked, they were absolutely confident that they would win the propaganda war following that. And given the role of the media and the general community in the propaganda being essential to developing support, do you think he was right that they would be confident that they would win the propaganda war, and why? How is it possible that they have managed to win the propaganda wars thus far?
It's not a mystery in as much as the left are rampant among the upper middle classes, the universities. You mentioned, I think, Robert, the voice referendum. It's an appalling idea that we should divide Australians by race, have two sets of citizens. Where were the elites with that division? Divisiveness. So, our great CEOs, our university vice chancellors, all the media, except that horrible Murdoch media.
Yeah.
In fact, the Australian newspaper were in the yes camp until the Saturday morning. And the very last line of the editorial was, with a heavy heart, we have to vote no. So, overwhelmingly, elites are in the left, but we're seeing cracks. We're seeing CEOs now saying, I think we better get back to business. So I'm quite optimistic that I think at least some of the money and the voices that were during the referendum are now just pulling back, like they got in too deep. So therein lies maybe some hope that at least some of the bigger money and the bigger stupidity will either butt out or will come back and say, I think we want to be on the side of those people who are successful and make a better world. And that won't be the Palestinian side. Maybe Palestinians, but it won't be, broadly speaking, the Palestinian side. So no mystery that the elites have moved left since the 1960s, but I do see cracks appearing that we might see some readjustment.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would say I think it probably exceeded Hamas's expectations, the propaganda. When they carried out the attack, I don't think they knew what would happen. I mean, we saw early on they had to lie. So with the hospital bombing, they came up with a lot of lies, and it spread like wildfire. We have to look at what's going on in the media. We know there is Qatari involvement. We know Al Jazeera has been a force for bad, which is platformed by the SBS. Taxpayers pay for it. It's broadcast all around. and it's picked up. We know the Chinese government is involved in, not just with TikTok, but in stirring up unrest in Western societies, and we have a report from the Epoch Times who knows all about this, what the CCP has been doing. So I think we need to look at some of these sources of funding, what's going on in the media. The ABC obviously is always terrible, and it really needs to be privatized or some serious changes there. So I think, yeah, those are just a few of the media type areas we can work on.
Carrie and Robert, I just want to thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom with us tonight. It's been a pleasure, it's been an honour. Please thank Carrie and Robert for us. People for about 10 minutes and then we'll have to vacate the property. Otherwise, thank you everybody for coming and thank you for joining. Look out for Melanie Phillips' new book, Under Siege, when it comes out. Thank you. And Dr. Johnson's book as well. Yes, it's still recording. And it's now so.